the planning side of things, we have to sort of look at the whole thing as far as the brief is concerned, see what the requirements are as far as the client is concerned, what size the project is going to be, single story, two-story, all those issues needed. Also the budget is required as well. If the budget is going to be restricting the client in as far as the design is concerned, then we have to consider that as well. Larger projects obviously take a little bit more time and more requirements as far as planning is concerned, but smaller projects seem to sort of go through much quicker. In as far as the brief is concerned, once that is completed and we have everything sorted out with the client, we can then get into the concept design. And the concept design is going to give the client a plan, elevations and some costing as far as the project is concerned. That will determine then whether that is the particular sort of style that the client wants and the size, and also whether it falls within the budget. If everything is satisfactory, then we proceed to the next stage.
Now that concept drawing would be sent to the council?
Now that's the second stage of that part is actually the planning requirements which need to be covered. And with that we provide a planning application to the council where we have plans, elevations, site plan and any other issues that need to be sort of checked. If it's commercial, then we also need to look at traffic control. How the vehicles go in and out of the property, if there's any occurrence as far as traffic jamming, whether it's the side streets or the main road, and we have to advise on that side of things. Also any sort of overshadowing. If the property is two-storey high, we have to look at it and make sure that it doesn't overshadow the adjoining properties, because if it does overshadow, we have to then work out how we can set it back to actually have that property fit in within the requirements of the planning. And we also have to sort of consider the siting of the building on the actual site, so it doesn't sort of intervene with any boundaries, etc. Once we have established all of that and it's all sorted out and the actual client is happy, we then submit the planning requirements drawings to the council.
These, what we call reactive clays, that's their correct classification, are very fine-grained soils and they react with water, and that's where the term reactive comes from. So that when they absorb moisture and go from a drier to a wetter state, they tend to swell and cause upheaval of structures. And conversely, if we start off with a wet site, then it dries out, we will get a volumetric shrinkage of the soil and we tend to get settlements of structures. And you start seeing the cracking come in because corners drop and elevations drop, and we get cracks at ceiling cornices between the cornices and the walls. Those sorts of soils, unfortunately, are most acute in Adelaide with respect to the whole of Australia, but there is reactivity in clay soils throughout the other states of Australia, even in Perth where there's a lot of sand. East of the airport there is some clays, and they are just sort of running into the problems as they develop further out. And if you, for example, were buying an allotment on the low side of a road so that you didn't have drainage by natural gravity, then you might like to find out that there's an easement at the back that you can put your stormwater into, connect into your stormwater. And that would make life a lot easier. The other thing we notice about sloping sites, whether they be on the low side of the road or the high side of the road, is people forget about the cost of retaining walls. And retaining walls can be exceptionally expensive, and if overlooked, that cost can be quite crippling for a homeowner when council say, look, you have to retain that site because you've cut more than 600 millimetres on a boundary, or you want to put more than 200 millimetres of filling on a boundary.
What costs could they be looking at?
Well, you could be looking at costs of around $900 a metre, $1,000 a metre. That's a linear metre to build them. If you've got a steeply sloping allotment, you can be up for retaining walls of the order of 2 metres high or even higher than that. You might be undermining your neighbour's property, or you might be undermining and causing loss of stability of any structures on the neighbours' properties. So you do have to be very, very careful when you're looking at sloping land and get architectural and engineering advice about how to manage it.
And how does certification fit into the overall building process?
Certification is part 2 of the overall process. Your first part is the planning consent, which has been dealt with by the planner. Once that's been gained, then, as I said, we need to look at documentation in order to issue you a building consent. So we're step 2. The planning consent plus the building consent equals the full approval. And that's where we fit in, part 2. So we have to ensure that we've got the right documentation. We liaise with the builder, the architect, the engineers, whoever it may be, to ensure that we satisfy the legal requirements to have the right documentation and enable us to issue that consent or that approval.
What about variations to planning consent and sometimes conditions on planning consent?
Variations are a major issue, and as we've discussed, it is really worthwhile to try and make sure that you minimise variations. There are times when variations have to be made, and there is a legislative leeway there for us to be able to make some variations to an approved document if indeed there's some other legislative need for it. So for example, if you had a structural element that was in the way of a window, certainly you might be able to move the window or move some other aspect of the building in order to satisfy that other structural building code requirement. Those sort of things can be accommodated. Other variations, not so easy. If you wanted to add to the size of a building, generally that would trigger a whole new development application. You really need to be sure up front as much as possible that that is the project that you've settled on and you need to stick with it. That is also important, of course, for the builder, that there aren't too many variations during that process.